Good afternoon, everyone. I'm John Brennan with Continuity Insights, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, the BC Mindset for Addressing Unknown Business Disruptions, which will be presented by Bill Morris and Rebecca Wine of Virtual Corporation. Before we jump in and get started, I have two questions for you to consider. When you think about the data you meticulously gather for disruptive scenarios as you prepare for the fall of a short of matching the event to disrupt your business functions, are you ready? Have you considered your audience and the types of questions that will elicit useful information? In today's webinar, we'll discuss how this can help you build a plan that is flexible in execution, allowing you to adapt recovery efforts to the actual business disruption. So before we get started, let me review a few quick items with you. Throughout today's presentation, you will have the opportunity to submit questions by typing into the questions pane of your control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them at the conclusion of the webinar. Also, today's webinar will be recorded for later on-demand viewing, and as a registered participant, you will receive a link to this recording. I would now like to introduce our presenters. Bill Morris is a senior BCM consultant at Virtual Corporation with over 30 years of experience specializing in business continuity and COOP, who has been worked in a wide variety of industries, including Fortune 500 companies. Rebecca Wine is a marketing manager at Virtual Corporation, who specializes in marketing software products, consulting services, and enterprise resilience marketing. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's get started. And please join me in welcoming Bill Morris and Rebecca Wine.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're from. This is Bill Morris, and hopefully today we'll be able to give you some ideas to think about for starting either a new business continuity program or enhancing one that you already have. So our agenda today is, first we'll talk a little bit about the complex BCP landscape that we'll be dealing with today in this day and age, as well as a common approach to BCP planning that a lot of organizations use. And we'll talk a little bit about a basic foundation that a successful BC program needs, as well as some roadblocks and opportunities that you frequently run into. Again, an important criteria is your audience. Who are you talking to? Who are you getting information from? Who is using that information? So understanding our audience is an important aspect as well. Then a framework. This is the process that how we're going to use our plan that we put together. And then finally, we'll talk about some of the questions. Are we asking the wrong ones when we do a BIA, and what are the right questions that we should be asking? And then a few words conclusion. So first of all, the BCP landscape. As you can see, it's pretty complex. Today's landscape is very integrated, that we have the employees and we have the customers and assets, but they're all revolving around those products and services. And we have different things that we have to address, whether it's protecting the people, mitigating risk, supporting the customers, whatever. There's a lot of things and they're all interconnected. And so we have to look at that. And one of our challenges is to simplify this so that we can do it without getting completely crazy and going down a rat's hole. So a common approach that's used today is, first of all, identify planners. Those are the individuals who are responsible for the information to populate your plan.
Bill, I was just curious if you can provide some further clarification on who these planners are.
Yes, yeah, they're typically the people that are in the business department, and they're responsible for collecting the data. But they're considered, but also it can be a little bit broader than that to include even management, other people, subject matter experts that feed these planners to give the information. So they're not doing it all on their own, but the planner is really that point of contact to build the plan and be responsible for the plan, even though they use a lot of other resources. business impact analysis we usually start out with, which is really say, what do we do that's critical to the business and what would happen if it failed? And what functions can we suspend for the duration of the disaster? Really setting the groundwork for how we're going to recover from an incident. Then prioritizing and planning. We say, okay, what's going to be our sequence of recovery? We've got a lot of things we do. In what order do we recover them? And then have strategies and tasks and resources in place to address that recovery. Often, though, the plans aren't really fully tested, routinely updated, or really followed in an emergency.
Can you tell me why that would be, Bill? Why would they not be fully tested, routinely updated, or followed in a case of an emergency?
Well, yeah, there's lots of reasons. That one of the things I mentioned before about the foundation is if you don't have a good foundation to support your business planning effort, that can create a problem. If you don't have management support, because a lot of the people working on the plans, it's not their only job. So they're torn. And if you don't have the management support to say, this is a priority, this really has to be done, some shortcuts need to be taken and are taken very often. And sometimes it's not an actual plan. You have a lot of information there, but it's not something we can take action. And very often when we try to predict what's going to happen and set up a plan, it doesn't match what really happens in the real world. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why this doesn't happen, because all that testing and updating and everything, it takes time, it takes effort. But we can make it a little easier by the way we put our plan together and have a proper foundation.
Okay, thank you.
So speaking of the foundation, some of the elements of a BCP foundation is the first thing and the important thing is engage management to get their buy-in and support, because as I mentioned, it's not necessarily somebody's only job. So we need to say that is a priority, that you're doing that. It's not just something you do if you've got time. It's something that is actually important. And you need management's buy-in that not only understands it, accepts it, but supports it. And implement some form of BCP governance. Now, BCP governance can include an awful lot of things, but some of them, the key points is some BCP structure, some general policies and procedures to follow, goals, guidelines, giving direction to the planners, and also an ongoing process for exercising and reviewing your plan so that we have a process in place to make sure that they stay current and they're up to date, and a communication system. How do we talk to each other? How do we communicate? Those are just a few. There's a lot of other stuff, but it is something that we can start small and we can evolve over time. But to have some kind of basic control foundation in there in the beginning is critical. Also, a comprehensive training program for all levels. This is important only because to understand the BC concepts as well as the actual mechanics of your plan is important. And with turnover, very often somebody else gets into a BC slot or responsibility, and they haven't had that training. So to have that available so that anybody that goes in there, there's some minimum training requirements that you have in place. And encourage a recovery mindset. We'll talk about this a lot. That's kind of the title of the presentation, so we better talk about it a lot. But what we're really talking about here is when you put together a plan, it may not match because you're predicting something. You're saying, okay, I'm going to plan for this event that's going to happen sometime in the future, but I don't really know what that event is. But if we have a recovery mindset, if we start building our plan, and by the virtue of the fact we've built this plan and looked at dependencies, looked at processes, looked at all of this stuff, we start thinking about recovery. We start thinking about single points of failure and what could go wrong and how to recover from it. So we have that mindset where, as opposed to just saying, well, I can handle it, I can take care of it, but you really get into it a little more deeper by going through the process. Develop a support system. You've got a lot of people maybe that don't have a lot of experience in BC that you're depending on out there to gather information, use the plans, et cetera. So have a support system so that they can access that support and get the help they need when they need it. So they don't feel like they're left out all alone. And prepare answers to planners' questions, what's in it for me? And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But the point being is you want them to do something. Well, why are they doing it? So you really have to you can't just go out there and say, I want you to answer these questions and that's it. You really need to talk about what's the value in this? Why should they be doing it? And so really be prepared to answer those questions. Okay. When we introduce a BC program really for the first time, or if you want to do major enhancements as well, you come to management and it's going to require some resources, whether people, money, whatever, to do this, and you want them to do it. The first thing you're going to get is a deer in the headlights and a lot of skepticism. They're not saying, well, is this really something we want to do? Why do you want to do this? Why is this important? And you don't have an easy sell in a lot of cases. So one of the things you can do is look at some of the roadblocks and the opportunities that you have. Now, this is really just a starting point. What you do is take something like this, which is a common SWOT analysis, and make it your own. Add or subtract in the various quadrants here so that you can build on those strengths and look at the opportunities that you can exploit and mitigate any threats. And overcome the weaknesses. I mean, very often business knowledge and internal and external relationships is usually a big strength and gives you a good foundation. But you also frequently have a lack of BCP knowledge, a lot of information and complexity, and are your plans actionable? And the threats, again, executive support, which I mentioned before already, it is time consuming, and planners are fully employed. That's certainly an issue, is if they're already pretty busy and in complete training. Some of the opportunities I mentioned before about what's in it for me, well, there's the ability to learn new skills. There's some recognition, which you can make sure that you build into your program, is recognizing people that do a good job, that present ideas, et cetera, and maybe some kinds of rewards. So there's ways that you can encourage people to participate and to take part in it. But add to this and make this something that is really going to give you a good idea of the landscape that you're facing when you start planning. Now, your audience, I mentioned there are a lot of audiences to consider, and one of the things that you want to think about is the fact that you are given people to help you, and you say that you're in charge of the BC program, and these are the people that are going to assist you in doing that. And typically you'll get maybe the person who's just unaware. They don't know that the program exists. They just were told, here, show up here, and this is going to be your job. And if you're lucky, you might get a draftee who's been mandated to participate, but he doesn't really see the value. And extremely lucky if you get somebody who's a willing participant in the program, but didn't ask for it, doesn't really endorse it. And then we get into the less likely of a loyalist who proactively participates in the program and does see its value, up to an evangelist, which is extremely rare, endorses the program to other audiences. The reason being, keeping in mind, is that these people are generally not put in this position as their only job. They're put in this position and they're selected because, first of all, they're available. They're not fully utilized. No, you don't see in that criteria about how they're chosen is BCP knowledge, business knowledge, or whatever. You may get somebody who is new to the company, so they don't know the business, and they don't have any background in business continuity. But that's what you have. So the important point in this, and showing this and saying that you're going to most likely get people at this end of the scale, is that it makes that training and that inclusion and what's in it for me, and you have to build on what you have. And you can do that, and you can build up this stream, and you can move people up that chain. by having proper training and proper involvement and proper reward system. Now, the important thing and where it differs from a lot of the current BC planning is build a framework, follow a framework, not a prescription. In other words, let's not say you're going to do A, B, C, and D, but let's put our recovery in some kind of a framework. Now, what's a BC framework? Well, first of all, you expect to be able to pull out your plan and begin recovery right away. In the time that I've worked with business continuity, I don't think I've ever seen an organization where they've run into an event, they pull out their plan and say, okay, here's my guide. I'm just going to go through it from beginning to end, and I'm going to recover. It just doesn't work that way.
Well, Bill, let me stop you. Let me ask, what about in an emergency? So you've built this plan and an emergency happens, but you can't use it?
Well, yes and no. It's a good question, and it's a question that I think a lot of us would have. What's the point? But there's some things that can be wrong with it. Is typically the plan doesn't match the actual event, and there's a lot of information, and maybe it's not terribly actionable. But that's because a lot of the plans are prescriptive. They're saying they're trying to presuppose what's going to happen and respond accordingly, and do that up front. So the idea is that if you have the plan and you've put through the plan, you've got the data, you've got the information, you've got what you need. It's just a matter of assembling it properly and working with it, but it's not just following the plan as though it were a cookbook. It's not that straightforward. You've got to maneuver and massage it a bit. And that comes into where that mindset comes in, that you've built that plan, you've developed that mindset, so now you're in a better position once you know what the event is. Okay, you can react to it accordingly.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Plans work for, and this is really part of that too, is plans, the prescriptive type of plan works for predictable disruptions, where actual disruptions aren't really predictable normally, that they're ambiguous, complex, unpredictable, and constantly changing. So the plans that work for actual disruptive events that have all those things that we don't know and we can't really plan for have to contain an adaptable process, something that is not a cookbook process, but something that can change and adapt to whatever the real events are, and provide those tools and information that you can reference and use as needed in your recovery process, but you may use them in different ways depending on what the actual event is. Now that process, that adaptable process can be explained pretty simply. It's in practice, it gets a little bit more to it, but as an overview, it really is 4 distinct steps. The first thing to do is understand what the situation is. Really, how can you define the problem? What is the situation? If I can't get into the building, what does that mean? What is the situation? What problem does that create? Gather as much of that critical information that you can. And then the next step is to visualize what your goals are. What do you want to accomplish? Well, I need to get these functions up and running. I need to do this. I need to move my people. I have to do certain things to my goal. And then you say, well, what tasks do I have to perform? And describe is, what are my paths? What are my tasks that will get me to that goal? And once I have that, then I can say, direct that. I can assign it to people. I can adjust the tasks. I can watch it. I can monitor what's going on, and all that I'm taking all the information that I've gathered in my plan, that detailed information, and now I'm figuring out how I'm going to use it and what I have to do. Now that is very straightforward, but the important thing to understand is this cycle is repeated over and over and over, especially if it's a very long, drawn out, take the pandemic we just are going through. That's lasted for a very long time. And it's constantly changing. The landscape constantly changes. So we constantly have to go to this first step and re-understand where are we today and what's different now, and then proceed with all the rest of the steps. And we have to do that over and over. We have to do it more and more as an event goes on for a long time. Okay, so that's the process. That's an adaptable process. We've got a foundation and we've got a process. Now we want to think about what are the questions that we talk about and that we ask. Okay. So first of all, are we asking the wrong questions? Not necessarily. Wrong and right is probably a misnomer, but we're not necessarily answering the wrong questions. But one of the things that we can do is with the questions that we are asking is we can oftentimes put the planner on the defensive.
Bill, what would you do in the situation when a planner is defensive? I mean, how do you respond to a planner who's defensive?
Well, yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think that one of the things you're going to think about is, first of all, why are they on the defensive? And because you ask very often some questions, is this critical, or is this is what you do critical? And can we stop this function that you perform for a while? Do we have to do it right now? And you're thinking, well, gee, this may put my job in jeopardy because you're asking me if my job is important, and can we stop it? And maybe I have to go in there and justify my job and make it sound like more than it is, or whatever. But I think that the way you address that is you don't talk about what's critical or what isn't critical, because if we do the job, it's critical. Anything we do for a company is critical, or we wouldn't be doing it. The question is how time sensitive it is. And you can use lots of examples, but let's say if you're talking about manufacturing, if you don't have, let's say if you're a just-in-time manufacturing environment, if you do that, and if you have a just-in-time manufacturing environment and the manufacturing goes down, there's an immediate impact on the customer. And whereas if you are part of the team to strategize for your marketing plans for the future, you have a longer lead time. There's a lot of strategy, a lot of upfront work to get your marketing plans in place. So yes, you're going to feel a severe impact if you don't do that marketing, and your sales will ultimately suffer. However, that is not going to happen quite as quickly as the loss of manufacturing. So it's how time sensitive it is. It's not how critical it is. So that way, again, it depends on how you ask the question and the question you ask.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the planners may be overwhelmed. That very often there's too much information, and they don't know a lot of the answers. They don't know, maybe you're asking a question about applications that they rely on to do their work. And those applications, you may ask them some technical information about those applications, and they don't know the answers to that. So, and really knowing the answers to that isn't really going to help in recovery. And so they don't understand why that data is being collected, and it's very time consuming. So really, we want to try to not overwhelm the people by asking questions that, number one, they can't answer, and number two, maybe don't help them with the recovery process. And your organization's depending on meaningful, subjective, and objective information to create effective plans. But answers really can be skewed by either overstating the impacts to make my job more important, or deferring dependencies to say, well, it's IT's problem that the application isn't available, and so there's nothing I can do. So, and that's, that's just passing the buck. But what you have to consider is, well, what do I do with that application unavailable? So not allow them to pass that buck. So there's objective and subjective information that are very important. So what are the right questions? Some guidelines for for the right questions that we can have. That there's a lot of ways we can do it, and it's not necessarily the questions themselves, but how do we approach those questions? Maybe coming up with the questions, one of the ways is to understand the process, walk through our process, and discover potential points of failure. Let the data direct our planning efforts so that we know where we're going, because we understand the process rather than just asking the tried and true questions.
Now, Bill, speaking of a different approach, how would business continuity management be included in the change control process here?
Okay, well, that's an important consideration that you bring up, is the change control process, is that sometimes that isn't considered as a critical part of a business continuity program, but yet it is. The change control process typically, and very often, IT is big on change control processes, probably more than the rest of the organization. And it means any change is look at the impacts and look at what the effects that change has. If you add a new function, if you acquire a company, if you reimagine a function and do it maybe in a different way or thing, that what does that affect as far as applications you need and other things maybe is considered. But how does it affect business continuity? Oftentimes that's not connected with that change control process. So we have to know, if we do something like that, very often it's going to change our recovery process, and we have to go back and look at it. So if we have the change control process connected, then we at least get a highlight that, hey, something has changed. Look at your plans, look at the processes. Do we have to adjust anything?
Okay, thanks for the clarification.
Okay, and that we ask questions and provide information, and so that we can develop our recovery strategy pretty quickly. So we want to have that information that we gather, again, as I said before, not prescriptive so much, but something that we can use in a different ways depending on what what's happening. And we don't want to get so detailed and get so down in the weeds that it just has made it overly complex. Because keeping in mind that our point here is to operate at some kind of a recovery level, at least on a temporary basis. It may not be 100%. Okay. Planners have limited time. That's one thing that we've talked about previously, is we want to be considerate of their time. Especially since they're not doing it full time very often, and we want to make sure that they feel their time is well spent. So they have other priorities. So we want to ask questions of them that, again, as I've said before, that they know the answers to, and it does support recovery. And give them some kind of an estimate, give them some kind of guideline about how much of their time is this going to take, so that they and their management are aware of what's being expected. And of course, it also requires that foundation of the management support. Our business is very complex. Yes, all businesses, and they become more and more complex as time goes on and everything becomes so interrelated. So we simplify. We don't have to get it right the first time. We can start small, we can evolve. Plans are never 100% day one. We're always learning and growing and evolving in our plans. So we want to set clear and reasonable expectations. We want to have, when I say reasonable, we want to be sure that we are reasonable, that we know where these expectations are going to go. And what are we asking of people? If they say they want something recovered in less than an hour, is that really reasonable? Is it possible? Is it necessary? It comes at a cost. And so we need to look at that and make sure that we understand that. There's no right or wrong. It's based on business knowledge and judgment. Your answer, many of the things we said, subjective information before. An RTO is very subjective. The recovery time objective for a function has to be brought up in 4 hours or 1 day or whatever it is. That's very subjective. Do we know exactly that that's right? No, but it's close. It's somewhere in the ballpark. So that's subjective information, but it's very critical. And again, it's not about the plan that you put together because, as I mentioned earlier, you may not actually use the plan as is, but you're going to use it as a source of information. You're going to use it as a guide.
Bill, speaking about the business being very complex and having reasonable expectations and simplifying processes, could you provide an example of how an individual or a department would actually simplify those processes?
Well, yes. I mean, it's something that, and I say this, and I've gotten a lot of pushback from it because on the surface, it's not realistic. And I guess even below the surface, it's not realistic to say, imagine that you have an issue in your department. I'm the human resource department, and I have an issue that I don't have access to my workplace, or I've lost a certain application I require, or a tornado has gone through. That I have all these things that affect me in the human resource department. Generally speaking, people tend to go and say, well, what are the other impacts that are going to affect me? What about this department, that department? What are all of these things? You have to really simplify and bring it into saying, what's going to happen with my department? What do I need to do my jobs, and what do I do if I don't have those? Assuming that everybody else is okay, the demands on your time and everything else remains the same, that you really have to take that into consideration. You have to look at it the way to oversimplify it. And that's not reality. In reality, lots of different people are going to be impacted if a hurricane comes through. But if you try to understand and try to plan for what's going to happen to everybody in the organization, you're going to get wound up so much that you're not going to be able to come up with anything. The idea of using this kind of approach is that you look at what would happen just in your area. I'm HR. I need these things in order to do my jobs, and I don't get them. How am I going to react? Now, when the event actually happens, using the adaptable process and the information you've gathered, now you know what some of the other impacts are, you know what some of the other things are happening, and you can recover accordingly. So it's important to, in planning, think very much in a silo form of thinking, but then you bring all that together when you actually do your recovery.
What a great example. Thank you.
Get everybody involved. Encourage feedback. One of the important things is on feedback is that you want to recognize that you get feedback. You want to react and respond to the feedback so that you will get more feedback. And ways that you can respond, you can show that you've implemented ideas that have come from somebody, because very often the planners are a small group of people, but the people using the plans are much larger. And getting feedback from them and actually implementing some of the ideas can encourage them to say, hey, I'm being listened to. What I say is important. And you might do that by publishing. Have something that comes out for your VCP program that says, okay, this is what's somebody has suggested, this is what we put in, we've changed this, we've done that, or why we're doing that. Things to get people interested, things that give people credit for doing some work, and maybe even giving them some kind of reward, some extra time off or something if they do something exceptional. But get them involved. And I know that that's talked about in a lot of different things, and I know I'm one of the complainers too that thinks that, well, oh, it sounds like a great idea, but it's not followed through. Well, it becomes extremely critical to follow it through in this particular case and make sure that it does happen, because it can really make your organization a lot more robust. And getting everybody involved, especially people that don't have business continuity knowledge, because sometimes they have too much knowledge. So get people from other department personnel, subject matter experts that know the business, but they don't know business continuity. management, everybody, get them all involved in putting together your plan so that you get feedback from different points of view.
Now, Bill, I'm going to stop you, and I do have a question about involving management. Many of us may be curious, speaking about getting them involved, how would you suggest we do so?
Okay, well, management, getting them involved and again, it depends a little bit on, or a lot, on your culture, or the way you're organized and the way you do things. Some of the ways to get management is you can get some direction from management about the importance of things, showing the what our products and services are, what supports those products and services, and have, say, some kind of a I've often called a materiality matrix, is to show how important, how material is something to your recovery, or how large of an impact it has to your organization. So at a very high level, management can provide that. And if that's used, again, it's just like the feedback that you get from other people. But the other thing is training, is to make sure management is aware. And of course, you're not going to give the same training to a planner and to a manager or to an executive, but you can give them some kind of a training to show them this is what's happening, this is what we're doing, this is how we're approaching this, and then give them some occasional feedback, some reports. This is what our experience has been. We can audit our own system and say that these are our successes. This is where things have worked. This is where we've made a difference, and some of the additional benefits that we can get out of our business continuity planning. So keep communication lines open is I guess the bottom line, is to make sure they're aware of what's going on, that you take the time to give them presentations and show an interest in their ideas.
Okay, thank you.
Engage the planners is talking about the people who are actually doing the planning. Well, what's important there is that the planners understand why are we doing this? Is it a management mandate? Is it regulatory requirements? Is it something that's maybe going to give us a marketing edge because we can be resilient where maybe our competitors aren't? But why are we doing this? What's the end result of this? And always keep the goal in mind when we're asking a question. Make sure that the questions that we ask support that goal. And I already mentioned the simplifying, but also guard against solutioning. And one of the problems with solutioning, especially in the BIA, is if you're talking about the business impact analysis and you say, I need this certain dependency, and I'll go back to the most common, the applications, a computer application, is I need this. And say, well, if I don't have it, I could do such and such. Well, that's solutioning. The point is that we want to take into consideration as is. Say, okay, I don't have this application. What's the impact? What is that going to do to me? And then I can solution after I know the impact of not having it. Reason for that is if I say, oh, well, I can do X if I don't have Y, that's just in my head. I haven't documented that. Whereas if I say, this is what's going to happen if I don't have X, then Y can be my solution or my strategy that I can document. So it's important to keep that there so that people can actually see the path and where say, okay, here we are today, and here's what we can do about it. Now, a couple examples. We have some examples, and these are some typical examples, but I'm sure you can come up with your own very easily. But there's application dependencies. That's one that we talk about a lot. It's one of the big items since we're so dependent upon computer applications today. But very often we ask for things like application name, platform, the version of that application. That's an acronym for time to serious impact. When is it going to impact the functions that depend on that application? Where is it located? And what are the processes or functions that depend on that application? So that's typical questions we might ask. But I'll look at there and say, Does the business person know the platform or the version? Do they really know that information? Or is that something that is going to take them extra time to find out? And does that information help in recovery? And here, keep in mind, we're talking about the business. We're not talking about IT disaster recovery. We're talking about business recovery. So all they need to know is, how do I work if I don't have that application available? So it doesn't matter what platform it's on or what version it is. I just know it's not available and I have to have some kind of workaround procedures. So we're better off not even asking that question. It causes more trouble. Resources required. We might have some resources. For instance, there's lots of kinds of resources that we might need, but we just describe what the resource is, what do we normally have, and when do we need a resource. And there's maybe several time intervals. We want to see, depending on how long this disruption lasts, we may have different time frames. But can it be determined exactly when we're going to need a resource? And does that information aid in a recovery? Because why are we asking for the resource? Well, if we have to relocate or something, we may say, what resources do we have to have for this alternate facility? And couldn't we just ask for that, the minimum required for recovery, as opposed to what we need at various time intervals? And that's something that we probably won't be able to answer and doesn't help us that much anyway. And which actually brings up a good point is, I said that this is very often used when we have to relocate. Well, one thing that's come out of the pandemic is that relocating has always been a very common strategy. If your workplace is not available, if you can't go to your workplace for one reason, it's not available to you, to relocate to another facility. Well, with the pandemic, we found that really wasn't a viable solution either. So it turned out that a good portion of the workforce ended up working from home. We found that that worked quite well. And so there's a lot of organizations now have replaced that strategy of relocation to a strategy of working from home. So that's another thing that as we evolve, the strategies may change based on experience. A couple other examples is functions. We talk about our functions or business processes that we do. We maybe collect data about the name, the description, the recovery time objective, where that function is located, where it's run, criticality of it, and whether we can work remotely, perform this function. Well, is this redundant, criticality? Now, it may or may not be, depending on what your organization thinks, but at first glance, I'm saying, well, recovery time objective. If I have to recover that in less than an hour, doesn't that say something about criticality? And maybe we could just say, well, something in an hour to 4 hours is critical and so forth. And we could do something like that and putting our plan together without asking a question that might be redundant. And at best, how do I answer that question? And finally, contractual requirements is the requirements. What is that requirement that we have with a contract with a vendor or a supplier? What's the service level agreement and a penalty if it's missed, the time that's going to impact us, and who is that vendor? Well, first thing is, how do contractual requirements aid in recovery of that function? And if you don't have a dependency when you need it, the fact that the SLA was missed doesn't really help in recovery. So basically, we're saying this is something that we expect from this vendor. If we don't get it, we've got to find some way to work without it. But the fact that, yes, procurement needs this, and there's other areas of the organization that need this contractual information. But as far as our recovery plan, do we really need it? Is it important? So there's just a few ideas, but you get the idea of it's kind of that kind of thinking that you want to go through to come up with. Does the question make sense? And think of yourself as the one having to answer the questions rather than saying, okay, I'm going to ask this, not worry about how they're going to come up with it, but I just want the information. So in conclusion, that first of all, focus on recovery mindset rather than the plan. So we put the plan together, don't think we're going to pick it up and use it when the event happens, but have that recovery mindset so that we are mentally able to adjust and adapt when something happens. And keep in mind that audiences have different goals, interests, requirements, and they have to be considered in developing the data and the resulting plans, so that whether we're talking about a manager, a line worker, an outside party, everybody has a different point of view, and we have to consider those points of view. We can't predict the disruption. We don't know what's going to happen. That we didn't know what was going to happen specifically with the pandemic, and we certainly didn't anticipate the length of the pandemic. And that's true of most disruptions, most of them, that we don't know exactly what's going to happen, so we need to be able to adapt. And it's not just about recovery. It's about, there are other benefits, and keeping in mind that when we put together a business continuity plan, and this can also be some of the reasoning and the selling features, is there's other things. It points out where you have points of failure and you can mitigate risk. It shows where maybe a process is a bit clunky and you can improve that process and make it better. You can discover some workarounds. Very often you say, well, if I don't have this dependency, I just can't work. But if you press a little further, say, well, I could maybe do this or I could do that. And you might discover some workarounds that you didn't really think about before. And again, it helps you understand what the work is and what you're doing. You can streamline processes by discovering some of the dependencies and work products that really maybe don't contribute to our end products and services, but we have them in there. Maybe we can eliminate some things. Maybe we can make that process a little bit more streamlined. Tribal knowledge is another very important part, is that a lot of information is in people's heads. And by putting it together in a recovery plan, we start to understand what we do, the processes we perform, the interdependencies within the organization, and we document this. And if the person who has this in his head, for some reason, isn't available during that emergency, there's somebody else that can pick up that plan and say, okay, I understand what needs to be done. Our reputation, certainly our reputation as being a resilient organization is going to be very impressive, and it can help give us a competitive advantage that when we market, we can really sell this as being something that's important. As a matter of fact, some vendors and suppliers now that are required at the contract to show that they have business continuity plans in place so that they will always be there for their customers. Okay, so that's some ideas, some thoughts, just some ideas that maybe you can use and think about. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Don.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Excellent presentation. We've had a significant number of questions that have rolled in here during the presentation. I'd like to get to as many as we can. Rebecca, you've been monitoring them. If you could jump in and maybe ask a few of those to get us going.
Sure, that'd be great. And if we don't get to your question, go ahead and feel free to ask any additional, and we can individually reach out to you with an answer. So Lauren has said she loves the idea of having these good in-depth conversations with plan owners. However, this isn't a sustainable or time-sensitive method for a large global company. What suggestions do you have for translating this conversation to a form?
Oh, good question. And I don't know that it's an easy one to answer. And what I'm saying is, and it may be kind of like a focus group type of an organization, because I certainly understand that if you have a big company, big organization, that it's not something that you can really necessarily get everybody involved in. But you can ask for feedback, you get a focus group, you can get some ideas, and basically the idea is to go beyond that small unit that is putting together the plan and get some people that are really actually using it on the front lines that really know the information. And you can use different groups of people at different times. But I think it would be probably with a large organization like you're referring to here, that it's got to be a sampling group. You cannot have a great in-depth conversation with the entire organization on an ongoing basis.
Great. Eric has asked if there is doubt that the responder lacks the level of knowledge, what about using the functions leader to review and approve the responses?
Okay, that's really a good point, and that's one of the things that I think that I mentioned, but not quite in this way, is that yeah, that they're going to be. It's not only just a lack of knowledge, but it's a different point of view, a different looking at it from a different place. So I think that, like, for one of the things that we do is with the BIA is the first thing you do when you do a business impact analysis is you do a findings report or something. You summarize what you found out in the BIA, and then you go to different places, different people, whether it's your management, other coworkers, subject matter experts, whoever they may be, and maybe line people that aren't really involved in the process, and ask them to take a look at it. Does it make sense? Did you pick the right functions? Did you pick the right impacts that could happen and dependencies and so forth? Does that make sense from your on-the-job knowledge? And basically the same thing with a plan. Once you've done the plan, get the people involved in recovery to go through, say, a tabletop exercise to actually walk through it and say, have a sample scenario, and this is what may happen. How are you going to use your plan, and how are you going to resolve it? So I would say that would be the more people that you can get involved, the better.
Perfect. Kent has asked, would it not be better to plan for the effect rather than the cause?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In other words, if I understand your question correctly, that let's just take something simple, the workplace. You lose your workplace. Well, why did I lose it? There was an electrical fire. There was an explosion. There was a gas leak. There was a flood. I mean, I could go on as to the cause of, but it doesn't matter. All that matters is you've lost your workplace and you have to adapt to that. You have to work from home, relocate, do something else, but you can't use that workplace. It may be gone, it may be there, but just not accessible. So the cause doesn't matter. And I think you're very right. That's a very good point, is that you want to look at the effect.
Perfect. Christine has asked, how do you measure success of your work?
That's a tricky question, and it's a good question, but it's a tricky one, because you can look at the metrics to measure the success, and you have to think again of what they're going to tell you. It's like one of the examples that I can use is, say, I saw a metrics where it was measured how many cases that the help desk closed in a week or a month, and the numbers kept going up, and only to discover that, yeah, they were closing more and more cases, but they weren't necessarily satisfying the customer or really resolving the issue. They were just closing a lot of cases. So sometimes the metrics that you use are extremely important. So how do you measure? You can certainly measure some things, some metrics as to how many plans you have, how many companies have plans, business impact analysis, how often have they been tested, what are the lessons learned, what's the follow-up, what mitigations have been implemented. So some of these things to say, what have been some of the effects that have happened as a result of the planning process. And you can do that, and certainly it applies whether you've had an event or not. Even if you haven't had an event, that you have the plans, you've done tests, and you've found out things, and you've learned things, and you've changed things either in your processes or in your plans themselves. So I think that's kind of the thing. And obviously you can do some metrics and lessons learned in an actual event, but it again gets us back to why testing becomes extremely important, because it does show if we're making some progress in our planning.
Okay. Rick has said, thank you for the presentation and information. What advice do you have for adapting BC in a marketplace that essentially is outsourcing everything from supply chain to technology?
Good. That's another good point, because that's happening a lot these days, where a lot of things are outsourced and you get the specialty organizations. But again, they're just an extended arm of your organization. So that becomes what you expect from them. They are basically just another dependency. You're depending on them, and you're depending on them for something. So you look at it the way you would any other dependency. Is if I have just look at your question again, a marketplace actually outsourcing everything. Okay, well, if you have things in your supply chain or whatever it is that you're outsourcing, they have certain deliverables that you depend on. And you have to look at those and say, well, a few things. You go a step further, you say, well, what do I do if I don't get that deliverable from this? And you have different strategies, maybe alternate suppliers or whatever. But also goes back to what I said earlier about having your contract with those suppliers contain a requirement for some kind of a business recovery plan or program for the supplier, to see what is the risk level of that vendor or supplier or external party. So that becomes a concern or a consideration in selecting your suppliers. So it's treated like every other dependency in a way, but then you can go a little bit beyond that by some of the things you require of them.
Great. Well, I did want to do one question from Dawn that we have just to wrap up. We only have a couple minutes left, so I will give that to Dawn.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Bill, I've been monitoring the questions today, a lot of great questions, and this is a question that we've come up with, taking a lot of the input from people that have asked questions. So it's going to take a thoughtful answer from you, but here it is. Regarding the BC mindset, what would you say are the top 3 takeaways?
Well, I think the top 3 takeaways from especially what we talked about now and having that BC mindset is you really need to have that good foundation. You have to have something there, some kind of structure. What are your plans going to look like? What are your policies, your procedures, how are you going to manage it and make sure that it works? So some kind of an organizational structure as a basis, and also to get management buy-in. The second thing would be that process, that adaptable process, to have a way of recovery that can adapt to the situations as they occur. And finally, it's not only the types of questions you ask, but how they are asked, because a lot of your planning and a lot of what you have available to you to recover is based on the answers to these questions. So you want to make sure that the questions are asked in a way that you're going to elicit the right information, the information that's really going to be useful to you. So I think that the foundation, the adaptable process, and the questions themselves are probably the 3 keys.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Great answer, and I thought it would be, and I'm sure everybody appreciates that. Unfortunately, we've run out of time today, but we had a lot of great questions we didn't get to, but I want to let you know that Bill, if we didn't get your question, Bill has said that he will be reaching out to you directly to give you an answer to that question as well. And I want to let folks know that if you think of new questions, you can reach out to Bill directly. I will be providing you, I'll be following up with everyone tomorrow with an email. I will give you Bill's email address, and you can contact him directly if you do have a question you'd like answered. And to answer a lot of questions here, yes, we will be providing a copy of today's presentation, and I will be sending that out to you tomorrow, along with a link to the on-demand recording of this webinar. So I want to thank you again, Bill and Rebecca, and I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar, the BC Mindset for Addressing Unknown Business Disruptions. On behalf of Continuity Insights and Virtual Corporation, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.